All right. So welcome, Internet, to the second show of Informal Conversations. The date is May 14th, 2020. Your hosts are Dr. Adam Ellwanger and Dr. Mike Duncan, myself. The topic of this show is, should you get a PhD in the humanities?
Tough question, and a question that everybody who even contemplates graduate study in the humanities will spend a lot of time thinking about before they go and do that, and with good reason, I think. And so I think what we're going to do today, right, is we're going to talk a little bit about what graduate school in the humanities is and where the PhD fits into that. And then I think we're going to spend an equal allotment of time both arguing the idea that you should pursue a PhD in the humanities and that you shouldn't pursue a PhD in humanities. And then we'll have a little more discussion. But I think we'll start by just talking about how graduate school is organized, because some viewers might not know. And so, Mike, if you have different experiences than the way I'm laying it out here, by all means jump in. But so generally somebody pursues a bachelor's degree in English or a related field, right? And then typically you don't jump right from a bachelor's degree to a PhD program. Typically, at least in English, there's this middle step of the master's degree. And some programs have a master's degree that's linked to their PhD program. Some schools have what's called a freestanding master's degree that is not attached to any PhD program. But either way, the master's degree is usually a 2-year course of study if you go full time, and after that, right? If you've done well, sometimes there's this impulse to pursue a PhD, in part because a master's degree in a discipline like English or history or something like that doesn't often have a clear feed into a particular career. And so, Mike, you were saying a little earlier that, you can teach college level English with a master's degree, for example, right? And perhaps you can even get a full-time position at a community college. But generally speaking, if what you want...
Or a 4-year, depends.
Yeah, sure.
There's a nebulous placement for people who only have masters or masters in fine arts or whatnot. But generally speaking, you cannot get a tenure track position that would lead to a tenured professorship with only a master's degree. You need a PhD to get into that door.
Yeah. So typically, if you're out there and you're saying, I think I might want to be a professor, chances are you're probably going to need to complete a PhD if you want to have a stable livelihood. And so, after that, you apply to PhD programs, and typically a PhD program tends to be, some people take 5 years to finish it. Some people take 10 years to finish it. There's usually about 3 years of coursework that gets done beyond the master's degree. And then, assuming you pass all of your comprehensive exams and things like that, you will begin your dissertation. And depending on how much you like to write and how strong your idea is, you might do a dissertation very quickly. It may take you many years.
Adam, how long did it take you, start to finish?
Well, as you and the rest of our colleagues know, I'm a fantastic writer, and so
very humble.
Mine actually. I thought that I had much of mine written, even before I passed my comprehensive exams. And so after I finished my comprehensive exams, I went to my advisors and said, haha, surprise, I've already got 150 pages of it. I'm ahead of the game. And they were like, that's great, but let's start over. And so we started over, and I'd say it took me about 1.5 years.
So 5 years total?
Huh?
5 years total?
Yeah, I finished my PhD in 5 years.
I did too. I started in a master's program only, and then before I had finished it, I became a teaching assistant, and then applied to the PhD. And start to finish, it was 5 years.
I did,
but that was because I did the master's and the PhD at the same school, so all the master's credits carried over.
So for me, I did my 4 years of undergraduate and then took a year off. And then September 11th happened and my girlfriend left me and I was bummed out. And I was like, well, I should go to graduate school because I hate working at Barnes and Noble. Um, and so, well, this is kind of a romantic story, so I'll tell it, even though it's a distraction, right? I was up in New York State, where I'm from, and my girlfriend just left me. September 11th happened, and I was assistant manager at Barnes and Noble. And I had recently seen that movie Good Will Hunting. And if you remember, at the end of Good Will Hunting, the really smart kid decides he can't just live his life in Boston. He's going to go off and chase the girl. And to his mentor, he kind of leaves a note that says, I had to go see about a girl. Well, I was all bummed out, and I decided at midnight, I'm going back to graduate school, and I'm going to this town where my girlfriend who just left me is. And I snuck into Barnes & Noble at midnight and left the keys and a note on my boss's desk that said I had to go see about a girl. Let's see, 6 years later, I married her. But that was, long story short, that was when I decided to go to master's degree. So I spent 2 years doing the master's. After that, I got a job at the Medical University of South Carolina in their writing center, worked there for a year, then went to the PhD, and that took me 5 years.
So I don't want to take away from the drama of your story, but I do want to describe the next step in the process. So you have your PhD in hand, or you don't have your PhD in hand.
Let's back up one step. Like, just to say, most people understand that probably the way you're supporting yourself during a PhD is teaching lower level classes at the institution where you're studying.
That is the ideal way to do it.
In most cases, that's the case. And you need to understand that you are not going to make a lot of money doing that, right? What you're probably going to get for that is free tuition for your PhD, and then maybe somewhere between $12,000 and $25,000 a year to teach the courses that you are obligated to teach.
If that.
Yeah, right. And so that's something to think about, right? Like, you have to ask yourself, is $25,000 a year going to be enough for me to live off of? And remember, that's a generous stipend. So you may
or
be
4 to 5 years.
Right. And you may be taking out loans in addition to that if you can't live on that. At some schools, you'll be teaching with almost no oversight at all, right? That was the case where I went to my PhD. We'd get observed once a semester or something, but they were more or less my classes. In other PhD programs, you may have regular supervision of more advanced graduate students or professors. Did you teach on your own, Mike, or did you have people?
Almost entirely, yes. And we were very poorly paid. So I'd say I was on the low end of your scale.
Right. So now
again, I was living in a very cheap city, and I had almost no expenses.
Yeah.
Other than, a crummy apartment and well, actually I think that was my expense.
So you were saying, like, you were going to move us on. I just wanted to get that bit in about the labor. Oh, and one more thing before we go there. If you're watching this and you apply to a PhD program and they said to you, well, we'd love you to come. Please come. We don't have any money for you and we can't give you any abatements, but you should definitely come, right?
That's a big red flag.
Yes, I think that, Mike, you'd agree, right? That what that means is they're happy to take your money, right? But they don't really see you as a candidate who is prepared to complete the degree or is likely to finish it. And so generally speaking, I think the rule is if they tell you, sure, come to our PhD program, but we're not give you any money or tuition waiver, what they're saying is don't come.
Now, that's different from a master's program because not all people going to the master's share the same goal. A lot of people are there, they already have full-time jobs. They want to take the courses at night and work towards either a promotion at work that is tied directly to getting the degree, or they want to move into a different field, or they're working toward the PhD. So they're not necessarily wanting to teach, or they don't necessarily need the financial support.
And also, I would say that at the master's level, often there's no kind of work that you can do to get a stipend, right? Because if you're not yet qualified to teach, you know, it would make sense that you won't have a teaching assistantship or something like that.
The requirements for teaching at the college level differ for state. When I was in Tennessee, it was 18 graduate hours. So I took 2 semesters, one with 6 units, another with 9, and then I took another course in the summer, and then I was ready to teach.
Okay. See, I didn't teach at all during my master's degree. I just paid for it, you know, with student loans, and which I'm still paying. You know, but some, you know, so like if you're somebody who's thinking about a master's out there, I wouldn't necessarily expect that there's going to be any tuition adjustment or stipend or teaching assistantship. But at the
There
PhD,
might be a scholarship or two, but you're probably going to have to pay for most of it.
right. At the PhD level, that's different. At the PhD level, if they're not giving you any kind of assistance package, then you probably shouldn't go.
Right.
All right. So that said, though, let's say that you know, like like you've completed the master's degree, you're thinking about going to a PhD. Should we roll out the case for you should do it or you shouldn't do it first, Mike?
Before we do that, let's talk about the brass ring at the end first.
Okay.
So the goal, if you're getting a PhD, at least generally in the humanities, you're probably not going into a think tank or some sort of research institute, although those positions do exist. You're probably going for a professorship at some kind of university, whether that's the Ivy League, whether it's a state 4-year, whether it's a community college, whatnot. But you're looking for some kind of tenure track position. Something that will eventually, in 4 years, develop into a tenured position. Do we want to talk about what tenure is?
We probably should. Go ahead.
Okay, so tenure is not a lifetime non-fire position where you cannot be fired, but it's pretty close. It's a status where you cannot be fired without cause. So as long as you are a competent instructor and researcher, and colleague, it is very, very difficult to fire you without a very long and complicated process that it is generally not even worth beginning.
Mm-hmm.
It is generally harder to get it at the college level than, say, in a high school level. The time period is very long. So you took 5 years to get your PhD, it'll take 6 years to get tenure at, say, a state university. So that's 11 years start to finish.
And in many high schools, right, basically you're awarded tenure in states that have it really just for teaching your classes. As long as you taught your classes, you didn't harass any kids, you didn't get drunk at the prom, right, you'll get tenure, right? At the university level, there's actual benchmarks beyond just your everyday teaching and work that you need to meet to receive tenure.
Yeah, well, let's not get too deep in the weeds there, but basically you have to show, you're a good teacher, you can teach a variety of courses in your discipline, you've done published research in your field, you're able to work well with your colleagues and do all sorts of valuable committee work, maybe some inside the university and outside the university in the committee. You have to put together this huge packet that provides evidence that you have done those things. Your university may also require people from other universities to vouch for you. It's a process that takes about a year start to finish, and there are no guarantees.
One thing that needs to be mentioned is that it used to be, maybe 30, 40 years ago, that most of the people teaching in universities and colleges were either on the track towards getting tenure or tenured. Now, the tenure track position has become a much more elusive thing. It's much harder to find. And in fact, at many institutions, there are more people who are not on the tenure track and who are not tenured than there are who are on that line. And the reason that you really wouldn't, or at least would want to be cautious about pursuing a career in higher education is because really, a lecturer, if you're a lecturer, you're guaranteed a certain slate of courses each year, right? And generally, then you'd have a contract, though, which then could be or might not be renewed after a set number of years. Really, it's only the tenure track and tenured positions where you could say with any certainty, I could be at this university for the next 3 decades or something like that.
Another way to think about tenure track is you're being groomed for tenure. You're on the track towards tenure, whereas the full-time instructor or lecturer is only hired for a year, and they are then renewed or not renewed at the end of that year. It's a 1-year contract. Now, in practice, they're usually retained, but it's easier to get rid of them than it is someone on the tenure track or tenured.
And it's important to understand that even lectureships in some cases are hard to procure,
Yes.
right? That in fact, more often than not, the people teaching are what we call adjuncts, who just teach whatever courses they are given that are left over once all of the other faculty members have signed up for what they're going to take.
Yes,
And
the adjuncts are are paid per course, a flat fee usually. That varies widely between universities, and again, they actually have a worse situation because they don't have any guaranteed employment beyond the semester they're teaching.
And that money, I mean, if we were to figure out, like at my university, how much an adjunct makes to teach a single course versus what I, as a tenured faculty member, make to teach, I think it's something like they probably make about, what, like 20% of what I make to teach a course?
They'd be closer to half. I did the math some time ago.
That I think if it's half, then we're actually at a really good university in terms of that disparity. I think that
I know that our university, UHD, pays twice what my alma mater does.
Yeah, right. And the point is that oftentimes, I mean, I think I've done the math before. I think I roughly get paid about $8,000 or $9,000 per course that I teach. Right. An adjunct at UHD, I think, makes about 3,000. Right.
3,200 with a PhD.
3,200 with a PhD. Now think about that for a second, all of you out in grad school land. What that means is that if you can't land a lectureship or a tenure track professorship, right, then that means that in order to make $32,000 a year, you're going to need to teach about 10 courses.
And you will do that without any health benefits or guarantee of employment beyond the semester you are in.
And very few institutions are going to say, yeah, we have 10 sections or classes for you to teach, right? More likely what you're going to have to do is take 3 from this university, 2 from this university over here, 3 from this university over here. And if you live in a place like we live in Houston, what that means is you're going to be driving all over this megalopolis to different courses that have different requirements at different institutions to make $32,000 a year, right? And now I think we might as well say that we're deep into the reasons for why you shouldn't do this.
Yes. So let's continue in the doom and gloom scenario.
Okay.
So getting a tenure, the number of tenure track positions in any given discipline in, say, English is generally pretty low. They're about the same as they were 10 years ago when Adam and I got into this, but that's only for our respective disciplines. Adam and I have PhDs in rhetoric and composition. I'm more in the tech comm direction, and I'd say there's been a small decrease in the amount of available tenure track positions in those two disciplines. I think this year there were about 60 in rec comp, and maybe about 20 in tech comm, and that's for the whole country.
Right. And I'll add there that, so the year I finished my PhD and looked for jobs in rhetoric and composition, I found 90 jobs that were tenure track or tenured. Now, right, of those 90 jobs, I was probably unqualified just straight up for 30. In other words, the institution was too prestigious and I didn't have the CV to even compete a little bit, right? Now take off the other end, right? Off the bottom 30, there's probably 30 there that you're just like, I wouldn't teach there if I was offered a position, right? So for me, I was left with 30 jobs and I applied to 30 jobs, right? Of those 30 jobs I applied to, I got 7 interviews. I did 4 campus visits, and I got 4 offers and this was the one I took. And that was out of the entire nation. So I wasn't being like, oh, well, I live in this state, so I want to work in this state. That was me assuming I'll go anywhere in the country with some exceptions.
It's a little bit like the NBA draft, except you have slightly more control,
Yeah.
but not much. I applied to 50 positions. UHD was the last application I sent. It was my only offer.
Yeah.
If I had stopped at 49 applications, I would not be having this conversation with Dr. Ellwanger.
And so the point, our point is here is only that even if you get the PhD, and even if you do well at the PhD, like, you know, like Dr. Duncan was a stellar example of a PhD student. I was a very effective PhD student, right? And even if you ace it, right, you're guaranteed nothing.
Exactly. There's a lot of competition for those, you know, the 90 positions that Adam listed in 10 years ago.
And that's an important thing to say too, is that like, if there were only 90 PhDs being produced in a given year, right?
That'd be great.
Then everybody gets a job, right? But the point is that, you know, like my graduating PhD class at my university in the English department was 12. That's at one university, right? So now multiply that across every state in the country and every institution, and what we'll probably have is something more like 300 or 400 in the field. And then, right, figure that not everybody from the previous years got jobs. So they're still on the market, right? So there's really a pool, wouldn't you say, Mike, of probably 1,000 people or so competing for this handful of jobs at any given time.
That might be a little high, but I'm not going to dispute the number.
Yeah, I just figure all said and done, like professors who are looking for a new place to go, people who never got a job.
You're talking in English in general?
Yeah.
Yeah, then it might be a little higher because the literature people are in the worst boat.
Yeah, that's true. We
So-
should say that too. That's another reason to think about this, right? If you're, especially in English, and if your passion is literature, right? You have to understand that especially then I would be wary about going, because the tenure track positions in literature in particular are fewer than many other subdisciplines in English.
Rhetoric and composition is still the healthiest. You know, I said earlier there were 60 Rhet Comp and 20, maybe 30 Tech Com. That does not mean that Tech Com is less attractive, because there are less Tech Com programs. So there's not necessarily any more competition there. In fact, I'd say Tech Com is still, of the English discipline, still a reasonable bet. Yeah. But again, following the doom and gloom, let's say you do get a tenure track job. Well, now you have to earn tenure. That's not guaranteed either. You can fail. It happens regularly.
Yeah, it does.
And it is an up and out system like accounting. If you do not earn tenure when you go up for it, you have what is called a terminal year. And after that, you don't have a job.
That's right.
You will not be rehired.
If you don't get tenure, you get to stay for a year and then you have to leave. And you have to understand too that if you don't get tenure, then to some extent you're kind of damaged goods for going back on the market.
Unless we're denied tenure at an Ivy League. That's a badge of honor.
Yes.
If you get denied tenure at Harvard, that's your ticket to a tier 2 university. That's kind of expected. Yeah. The more prestigious schools churn through assistant professors like, you know, it's their purpose in life.
So I'll say this, when I was doing my master's degree and trying to figure out, should I go get a PhD, right? What my professors told me was, Adam, if there's anything else you think you could be happy doing, do that. And that was not because they were like, you can't do it, right? They just knew what the odds were, right? And they knew that, like, if you were sort of betting, and you are betting in a certain, that's a good way to think about it.
It is a bet.
If you're
it's a very long bet.
Yes, it's a long bet. right? And if you're going to pursue a PhD in English in hopes of becoming a professor, you understand you're laying a bet down, right? You're assuming that the money and time spent in that pursuit will in the end, like beat the odds and give you something of more value than you could have had if you hadn't done it, right? Now, this conversation is very odd, right? Because both Dr. Duncan and I are two people who beat the odds, right? And when I was a master's student and my professors told me, Adam, do anything else that you think could make you happy, right? What I left their office thinking was, I know the odds are bad, but I can do it, right?
Everybody thinks that.
That's the point. Is you watching this right now, the three of you who will ever watch this, are you guys, you three are thinking, I could do it. And here's the thing, you could, right? You could, right? You may be an excellent student who is cut out for this, right? And unfortunately, in the current state of affairs in higher ed, that is not a guarantee that you will be able to make a living doing it.
And that was not a guarantee 10 years ago either, or 10 years before.
That's right.
You have to balance that relentless idealistic hope you have with a realistic appraisal of your situation at all times.
And that's the question you need to ask yourself, I would say, right? I would say the question you need to ask yourself is, if I spend $80,000 doing this, I do it well, I do what I'm supposed to do, and on the other side, I get nothing for it, right? Will I be able to be happy under those circumstances? And if your answer is no, then I don't think you should do it, right? Personally. If your answer is yes, then do it, because even if it doesn't happen for you, you'll say, well, I just had to know if it would. That's what I did. Those are my life choices, and I'll move on. Now, we should talk about that too, because a lot of people, and you probably know a lot of them, Mike, and I know a lot of them, right? A lot of people finish the PhD, realize they're not going to get a tenure track or tenured position or a lectureship, and rather than say, well, I need to find something outside of higher ed to do, right? They decide they're going to do the thing where they're an adjunct and will teach 10 different courses a year at 3 different universities to make $32,000 a year. And it interests me that people make that choice because really, like, they could leave academic life, leave the university behind and make more money, unquestionably, right? Unquestionably. Well,
it's the same reason people stay in any other position. It's because they like it.
That's a part of it.
According to the alternatives, if your dream is to teach at the university, well, being an adjunct allows you to do that. It just doesn't come with the pay.
That's right. And I think that partly another factor that plays into it is one of the reasons that some of you might be wanting to pursue an academic career is because you have a perception that it's a relatively leisurely endeavor. And it's true.
That was my initial illusion. I was walking around the English department back in the day, and I was like, almost all these doors are closed. No one's ever here. They are they come here for like 20 minutes and they leave. What are they doing? I want this job. And now, we're both full professors now. We know that was an illusion. They were actually, some of them were working. Some of them were actually working. Some of them were not.
I think that it is a very leisured job, right? In this sense, I work hard, but I decide when I work, and there's a lot of
transitioning into the positives now. Am I correct?
We could.
Let's do that. Let's do that anyway. Let's transition into the positives. Okay.
So
let me start with some of them.
One of the positives is
go ahead.
If you can secure yourself work in a university, regardless of how much money you're making, right? And it's important to remember that if you want to have children one day, if you want to own a house, right, you have to consider how much money you're going to be making, right? But if you're happy, like however much you get paid, then university life does afford a lot of freedom in the sense that, and I often am, even when I'm pissed off about life at work, right, I'll catch myself and I'll realize I'm a 41-year-old man on a Wednesday at 1 p.m. reading on my couch. And then I think about how many other men my age have that luxury at that time of day on a Wednesday. And most don't, right? Most of them are at offices for 9 hours a day, and I am not. And, that really is a luxury. It's given me more time to spend with my children. And of course, like one thing that I really love about the university is, let's say you're having the worst semester you've ever had. Let's say you just can't stand your classes and your students can't seem to do anything right. Not that ever happens, right? But let's say that happens, right? Within a university, no matter how bad it is, you can say, in 15 more weeks, I'm going to get at least a month's break, right? And then everything resets with new students, new courses, new interests, new ideas, and that's one thing. And I think that contributes to sort of the luxurious aspects of the job.
Well, you can still have that as an adjunct.
That's true, and that's what I'm saying.
Just with less money.
Yes, I'm saying that if the money isn't an issue for you, right, then, and you just, all you want to do is work at teaching at a university, then yes, it does afford a certain kind of lifestyle that is, I think, highly desirable to a certain type of person.
I have a slightly different take, but I think the professor job, at least in sort of the English mildew that we're describing, is right for a certain...
Mildew? The milieu or mildew?
Milieu. I can't pronounce words.
Right.
It's right for a certain type of personality type. If you do not like the 9-to-5 experience, or if you don't particularly like being told what to do, then, well, this is a pretty good job for that. Your schedule is pretty flexible. As long as you don't have a class to teach in person, you don't necessarily have to go in on any specific day. You can work from home. We're all working from home right now, but even during a normal semester, you'd still have very wide freedom of how to arrange your schedule. You still have a lot of work. I usually work about 50 hours a week.
Me too.
And I probably pack about 80 hours of work into those 50 hours. But if I want to take off an hour and, play with my kids, like Adam says, I can do it. I can do it pretty much anytime I want. The pay is okay. You're not going to get rich unless you're, at a very prestigious university. We are not. UHD is, a state school. But the pay is pretty good. Given the considerations, there's a 401k, there's medical benefits.
If you can swing tenure, you've got really good job security.
You will not have to search for a job for the rest of your life, probably, if you get tenure. You can if you want. You can try to upgrade, but you don't have to. If you want to go to a higher rank, you can. You don't have to. If you want to go into administration, you can, but you don't have to. But I think the personality type that works best with professor is someone who is intellectually curious. If you do not feel like, if you look at journal articles or academic books and you look at them and you go, I don't really want to do that, and this is probably not the profession for you. If you have some sort of passion for research, for being curious about how things work or how to teach something or discovering new things, then this is not for you. I don't think you should even start or even consider the PhD. If you just want to be a professor and kind of, walk around in the tweed jacket and smoke the pipe and have people, oh yes, Professor Smith, don't even go there.
I would add that, if anybody's watching this and you are kind of an intellectually inclined person, then you might find, like I find, is that when you move around the world outside of the university, it's hard to find people, who are willing to have kind of abstract intellectual discussions with you about your topics of interest. And when you do find somebody who's willing, oftentimes that person isn't really competent in the subject matter, right? And so, like one of the great things to me about a university is that I could find myself in a community of people who can have fairly high level discussions with me about ideas, right? And that's something that's hard to find in the day-to-day world. And that in itself has value for me, that offsets any of the negatives about the work.
Yes, and those people will generally be in roughly the same life situation that you are, which adds to the camaraderie.
Mm-hmm.
Camaraderie, excuse me. I can't pronounce words today.
And it is very leisurely in that sense, right? Like the fact that, assuming that you are on campus and I'm on campus and neither of us have to be teaching at the moment, we can just say, hey, you want to go to lunch today? And walk down the street and have lunch, right? And
now we have to pay for that later.
right.
Now, we didn't grade for that hour. We didn't, work on an article for that hour. We didn't look at graduate applications for that hour. We just got to reshuffle things, but we have that freedom to do so.
Right.
What are the other benefits?
Well, I think that you can't ignore the fact that that regardless of whether or not you end up getting a job as a professor, if you pursue a PhD and complete it, right, then at very least you've learned something. And I think that there's some value in just cultivating a serious program of study and the way that improves your knowledge, not only of what a university is, it makes you become a better learner in everything, and also the PhD, even if you decide not to pursue a job as a professor, right? That is a certain marker that you are able to perform at a relatively high level of intellectual activity. And so I think that does have some value in the world beyond the campus. And, there's a whole growing sort of interest area in higher ed that I think they call Alt-Ac, right? ALT-AC, Alt-Ac. And this is getting a lot of play in English departments right now, because what English departments are saying is that for our graduate students, we need to place more emphasis on Alt-Ac. And what that stands for is alternative careers to academic ones, right?
I hadn't heard that acronym before, but I'm aware of the concept.
Yeah, right. And what this really is an acknowledgement by humanities disciplines that a great many of the students who are trained to be professors are not going to be professors. And given that reality, that there's this sort of growing movement to say we need to make students more adept at recognizing what these degrees can do for them outside of the world of higher ed. Now, how much value these degrees have outside the world of higher ed, I don't know, right? But I do know, right, that just having the PhD credential may open some doors for you in fields beyond the higher ed racket.
Possibly. One thing I wanted to mention, I think we're nearing the end here, is when you do go to the graduate school, when you do go to a PhD program, almost all of the knowledge and skills that you can learn are not dependent upon classes. I mean, all the journal articles and books and the research reports, they're just sitting there in the library. If you just get, really what you're getting out of the courses is guidance through the data. And even more so than that, you're looking for professors that you mesh with who can guide you even more than the ones that are kind of required to do so in the courses that you have to march through to get the PhD. You're looking for researchers or teachers that you have some sort of, there's that camaraderie word again, or
a connection to people you could find a connection to,
yeah, connection,
and that are willing to say to you, no, not like that, like this, right? And then you go back and try it again, and that's for me, like that was, I was fortunate to have mentors during my PhD program.
Yeah, mentor. That's
who
the word I was looking for.
would both tell me, that I was doing wrong or that I was doing poorly, right? And then say, now do it again, and have me look at it, right? And say, now this is better than it was. This is better than it was, but there's still a problem here. And then say, now do it again, right? And
And those particular people will be modeling how to be a professor for you too.
I mean, that's how you learn to be a professor. I mean, at least kind of. When you really learn to be a professor is when you start being one.
Yeah, after tenure.
Right. But I mean, like I think that that's a positive too, is that just you really do, a PhD program is really your first look behind the curtain of what life is like in a institution of higher education.
So let's talk about what the odds are on May 14th, 2020. We're all under lockdown. Well, Texas is moving out, but what are the odds? Is it a good bet? What do you think, Adam?
Well, if we're going to talk about it in the metaphor of bet, and I was talking to you a little earlier, and I said, you never know where higher education is going to be 10 years down the road. But I feel like I can often make educated guesses about where higher ed will be in 10 years. My confidence in those educated guesses are lower right now than they've ever been for me. And what I mean is, like, I'm less confident that I know what the university will look like in 10 or 20 years than I've ever been before. I think that the whole COVID-19 thing is going to dramatically change higher education. I have no idea how it's going to change higher education. And I don't think anybody does at this point. And so essentially we're in this position where we know things are going to change, but we don't know what's going to change, and we don't know whether it's going to be for the better or for the worse. And so, I mean, honestly, we're putting it in the logic of a bet. Like right now, I'd take my money off the table, right? And honestly,
Having won already.
huh?
Having
Well, right,
won already, easy to
right.
say.
Yes, but what I'm saying is that if I were finishing a master's degree personally, and I'm not saying this is what you should do or what anybody should do, right? What I'm saying is if I had just finished a master's degree, was thinking about going to pursue a PhD, if I was relatively young, right, and by that I mean under 25, right, I would probably take 2 years and see what happens, right, before I put my money back down. It's very difficult to see, like, how big a PhD class is going to be moving forward. I don't know if more people will apply, if fewer people will apply. It might be easier to get in now, right? It might be easier to get into a good PhD program right now. It might not be. I don't know.
Well, for me, the question is not getting into the program. It's what the job market will be like in 5 years. That's kind of hard to say. There are still some schools hiring for the fall. I've seen the temporary ads, but I think the overall market is going to crash once we get to sort of the beginning of the hiring season, which happens generally in October, September. The budgets simply aren't going to be there for the positions. Or if the budgets are there, they'll disappear by December. That happened to me a lot in 2000. What was it?
2009.
So early 2009, I'd go to the conference to interview a position, and there'd be a professor there sitting, well, thanks for coming, but we don't have any money.
We have to bear in mind, though, that like by the time you get to that question of like, hey, will there be a job for me? You're already in on the PhD, right? And of course, the job prospects should be a consideration before you begin a PhD. So you're right about that. But I mean, I would say, like, geez, who knows how much funding will be available for assistantships for new doctoral students in the fall? Who knows how many they'll be admitting, right? These are questions that we don't know the answer to yet. That said, right, if you're independently wealthy or something like that, or I would say if you're 30 years old and you've been kind of on the fence about this for say, the past 8 years, right? I would say it's now or never, right? In that case,
I
right?
think you have more options before you've taken the master's because, if you're working full time, you already have some income. You can take a graduate course or two a semester. It won't break the bank and it won't disrupt your ability to take an income, and that allows you to kind of get your feet wet and build up some courses towards a PhD. And then you can apply to a program, and if it doesn't, you don't get enough support, you can always back out.
Let me ask you this one. I'm curious what you think about this. How much of a consideration is somebody's age when they're considering beginning a PhD program?
We're getting into ageism here, Adam.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'll cancel myself before the next episode. What I'm trying to say is this, right? Like, I think, and I'm not saying ageism is good, right? But I think that it's probably harder if you complete a PhD at 50 years old and then go on the job market for the first time at 51. I assume for
Not
whatever,
necessarily.
huh?
Not necessarily, especially if you come in with a lot of industry experience.
Right. I'm not saying necessarily, but I'm saying I would suspect that the odds of somebody who are coming onto the market at 32 or 33 are better than somebody who's coming on at 52 or 53 for the first time.
I'd say that, there's a stereotype here is that generally, the prime hiring range for the newly minted PhD is late 20s, early 30s. You've had enough time to graduate with your bachelor's and get the PhD, so most people would not be able to go on the market before 27 or 28 at the earliest.
No.
But, if you're 40 by the time you've finished, then you might be seen as over the hill by that point.
I think there's also a consideration too that, if you're 50 years old when you're coming on the market, a university might realistically, they wouldn't say this explicitly, but I think
Yes, they would not say it explicitly because it is illegal.
some of them would be thinking, well, we might only get 10 years out of this person at best, right? Before
They want to run another search and do it all over again.
Right. Whereas with somebody who's 30, they could say, well, conceivably, we might get 30 years or 40 years out of this person, right? And so those realities, I think, for better or worse, inform some of the decision making, right, behind the scenes. And so I guess my only thing there is not to say that, well, don't go get a PhD if you're 50 now, right? My thing would be if you're 25 and playing with the idea, right, I think you're better off if you can make a decision in the next 2 or 3 years rather than the next 10 or 15. And that, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying I think that it's true that that's the case.
Yeah, once you have the PhD, it's generally evergreen.
Mm-hmm.
You can always update your training and your research and whatnot and showcase that you're current in your field.
Sure.
In other ways. So getting the PhD out of the way earlier rather than later is generally good.
Mm-hmm.
And once you started teaching or you're holding positions, whether they're tenure track or not, again, that shows that you're in the game.
Well, how about you, Mike? Maybe in closing, like I said, that if I were in that position about whether or not to jump into the PhD study right now, I'd probably take my money off the table for a year or two and watch. What would you do?
It would depend on if I already had the master's or not.
Okay. And if you did have the master's, then?
I would, again, follow your earlier advice and find a program that has support. I wouldn't consider doing it at all without teaching. I would refuse to pay a cent for a doctoral program right now.
I would have refused to pay a cent when I started in 2004, and I'd still refuse to pay a cent. Right. The risk is, and that's our point here, is that given that the PhD alone is already a risk, right, that you can't on top of that bear the whole burden of the expense of it with the possibility that none of it pays off anyways.
Well, let's not worry about how the university is making money off your graduate program. They're making money off of you if you're teaching 4 courses for pennies.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
They're getting states. If they're a state university, they're getting huge amounts of dollars just for having you on the books.
Although that might change soon.
Well, the operating understanding is that.
Yes.
Now, it's a private university. They'll make no. You probably shouldn't even go that route.
Mike, I think you have something planned for our next episode. What's the plan? We're gonna have a guest.
We will. I think what we're going to do is invite a mystery graduate student, which we will announce at the beginning of the episode, who was recently entered a PhD program, and ask the student what their position on this is, given that they are about to start a doctoral program under these very unusual conditions.
That'll be interesting. And next time I'll make sure to give a trigger warning before we start, just in case I say anything ageist or any otherist.
Maybe you should just kind of make that a sort of a standard disclaimer. We can just attach it to the beginning and cover our butts that way.
That's the topic of another episode, because I think that I actually have a thing on my syllabus that says I don't give trigger warnings. So if you're easily offended, go take another course.
You just pull the trigger.
That's right. Right. Well, the point is their trigger, not mine, and I can't know what's going to trigger them. You know.
Oh, Adam.
All right.
So, what is our verdict? Yes or no? This is like Ebert and Siskel.
Man, it's too hard to say for a general person, like a general answer. I don't know. Right. Like if you're the type of person who's just like fortune favors the bold, then do it. You know, that's what I did, right? Like I was just, because I'm a fool and think that I can do anything, right? I just decided, hey, I'm going to do this. But I did it knowing that number one, I might fail. And I also only took that step saying, I'm going to give this everything I can absolutely positively give it during the 5 years of study during the PhD, because I wanted to know that if it didn't work out for me on the other side, that it wasn't for lack of doing the right things or engaging it in the right spirit. And
another way to think about it is, well, how would you feel if you hadn't tried?
I'd probably be less happy, I think. And that's important to say. And I think, I also think, if you're going to do it, do it all the way, no halfway, no halfway at all. And part of what that means, I think, and we could talk about this in future episodes too, is like, sometimes I'm looking at a graduate student paper and I'll write down, you should consider blah, blah, blah. Right. And then I'll get the next draft and the person hasn't done it. Right. And I'll be like, what are they doing? And part of like what being a good PhD student means is if your professor says you should do this, it doesn't mean think about whether or not you think this is a good idea. It means do it. Right. Do it. And part of what being a PhD student means and being a good one, I think, is learning to be a student and a good student. Right. And part of what that means is if I'm your advisor and I tell you to go get me coffee, you go get me coffee. And if I tell you, and of course I'm brushing broad strokes here, but if I tell you to rewrite the essay this weekend, you rewrite the essay this weekend.
Adam, do not ask your graduate students to get you coffee.
I don't even drink coffee. My point is only that, right? Like, if you have a mentor, right, and you should, and especially if you're at a PhD,
listen to them. You
should seek one out, right? And part of what having a mentor means is doing what they say, regardless of what you think about it. And that's the way, I promise. It's hard to subordinate the self to that, but I promise when you let somebody mold you, what comes out on the other side will be better.
There is a danger to that, though. You could pick the wrong mentor.
Oh, yes. Right. You need to know where those barriers are. right? And that's why I'm joking about the coffee, right? Like if your advisor is literally telling you go get me coffee, right, that should be a sign that they might not be the best person to work with, right? But anything academically, right, just decide up front you're going to do what they say, right? And that's how it's going.
Well, let me add a little cautionary note to that. If you do get a piece of advice from a mentor that doesn't feel right, you can always ask for a second opinion.
Of course. And
Because we're very, very individualistic creatures. And if you ask, say, Adam, one of the reasons we have this show set the way it is because there is not necessarily a right answer to these questions. And one of us might have a better understanding of a certain thing, but I'm thinking of a couple examples where if I had just followed the advice of one person and not asked around, things would not have turned out as well for me.
Let me rephrase, because you're right. There are some exceptions to this. For example, right, a lot of my writing and research kind of goes against the accepted grain in the discipline. And I've had professors who are like, no, you can't argue that. That's not, that argument isn't justified or it's wrong, right? Again, that's a sign that this probably isn't the best person for you. I guess the proviso that I'd add is when you find someone who looks like they could be a good mentor and you trust them to be that, then do what they say, right? If you don't trust
I
them,
like that revision.
if you don't trust them, don't do it, right? And you gotta, at the end of the day, you owe it to yourself to have integrity in your own research and follow your own vision. But as far as letting somebody direct that vision and shape it, that's critical.
Yes, and we're talking basically about a dissertation chair.
Yeah. Yep.
Someone who will direct or help you shape your dissertation at the final stages.
So for the second time now, I've balked on giving a yes or no, but maybe you won't. Yes or no, Mike? If you're going to give a generalized one, should you do it?
My gut is yes.
Okay.
Especially for rhetoric and composition and tech comm. I think those are still evergreen fields, or as close to evergreen fields in English as there's going to be. There's always going to be demand for people to teach writing and to teach technical writing, regardless of what the economy looks like. And given that we're going to enter a recession of some kind, I don't know exactly how bad it will be or how long it will be. Traditionally, recessions are a good time to be in graduate school. If you can't make money, you can be training.
All right. Well, should we end it
Still
there?
haven't given a yes or no.
I won't. It depends. It depends on the person, right? I'm not going to give carte blanche to all the people who shouldn't be doing this by saying yes, right? Some of you should be doing it, and you should do it. Some of you shouldn't, and you should stop now.
So you have the traditional humanities answer to everything. It depends.
That's right.
All right, are we done?
We're done. I'm going to go drink some tea.
So am I.